Good evening and welcome. I am Lauren Swartz, the new president and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. I'm delighted to welcome the members of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia and other guests from around the region and country tonight. We are pleased to host today's webinar, Democracy on the Table. Is democracy in crisis in the U.S. and Western Europe? We at the Council are bringing you fresh, nonpartisan civil discourse on critical issues affecting the world. We have been and will continue to be dedicated to playing key roles in international affairs education for all ages by creating respectful and deep discussions. And we are continuing to ask the hard-hitting questions about the world around us, all from our home here in Philadelphia. I'd like to thank our education partner tonight, the Hobbs School of Business at St. Joseph's University, and our series corporate sponsor, KeyBank, for their longtime commitment to the Council's mission of bringing global education and civil discourse to Philadelphia and beyond. And I'd like to offer a special welcome to some of the high school students, college students, and teachers who participate in our education programs throughout the year. The World Affairs Council works with nearly 3,000 youth each year to provide foreign affairs and international education access throughout our region. As we all know, these students are not just the leaders of the future, but they are also our leaders of today. Tonight, we'll also get to hear from Nina Diaz, a junior at Bodine High School for International Affairs, who will pose our first audience question to our panel. The World Affairs Council of Philadelphia was a founding partner in 1981 at Bodine, a unique high school focused on international affairs, and we're excited to offer this student an opportunity. If you have any technical issues during the program, please use the questions bar, and the Council's Vice President of Programs, Haley Boyle, will help you behind the scenes. And later in the hour, if you would like to ask a question during the audience Q&A, please type it into the questions bar, and we'll get to as many of those as possible in the time allotted. Please send them along at any time during our discussion tonight. Now, I'd like to briefly introduce tonight's panelists. We're delighted to welcome Joshua Geltzer, the founding executive director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection, as well as a visiting professor of law at Georgetown University. Josh is also an International Security Program Fellow at New America and an Executive Editor at Just Security. We also welcome Holly Smetko, the Candler Professor of Media and International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at Emory University. Holly has written extensively, over 100 publications, about the influence, strategy, the media, and campaigns in international contexts. And last but certainly not least, we welcome Philadelphia's own David Thornburg, who serves as president and CEO of the Committee of 70, which champions for better government and for engaged and informed citizens in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. His leadership in the region and a leading voice across the country on a multitude of issues facing democracy and citizens is a critical perspective we are glad to have with us this evening. Welcome to you all. We'll start with some brief opening remarks from each of you, followed by some moderated discussion, and we'll conclude with the audience question and answer. Josh, could we start with you for opening remarks, please?
Absolutely, Lauren. Thank you for that very kind introduction, and what a pleasure to be with all of you for this conversation tonight. I'm grateful to the World Affairs Council for including me in this discussion. So we've all pledged to keep these brief. My goal is really to put some things on the table that we can then revisit in the course of this conversation. And big picture, what I worry about is that the U.S. democracy in particular, it isn't poof going away. It isn't we're not going to call ourselves a democracy. It isn't that we're not going to have core elements of our constitutional structure overnight, but that instead a few key elements that we regard, I think rightly, as central to healthy democratic functioning are dissolving, degrading, diminishing before our eyes. Let me say three categories that, again, we can come back to as they may be of interest. First is just law itself. Law seems increasingly politicized in this country. The ability to predict how federal and state judges are going to vote in particular cases based on the political party they're affiliated with or a president who nominated them is affiliated with, and the role of executive branch lawyers in using legal positions that to many don't make a lot of sense, but serve political agendas. That seems to take law and tear it a bit and allow something that's supposed to have bounds to become infected by politics. That's one. Second is the media and the free press. core, I think, to the democracy we have as we know it, not immediately going away. Indeed, in some ways, we're seeing particularly vibrant journalism holding those in power to account. And yet at the same time, how many Americans think about the free press, whether they respect that, whether they regard it as a source of facts versus just political agendas, that seems to be degrading. And finally, voting. Voting itself is not going away. In fact, we're seeing voting in incredible numbers. And I say that with a lot of excitement and enthusiasm in the current cycle. People aren't going to stop voting or being told writ large that they can't vote, but boy, is it getting harder. And a fight that should be about which candidates do you want up and down a ballot is increasingly becoming a fight about who can vote at all, or how hard you have to work to do so, or how certain you can be that your vote that you did cast will get counted. So those to me are three categories in which we don't see revocation. We don't see nullification of democratic elements, but we see some degradation that makes me worried. Let me leave it there for now, Lauren.
Thanks, Josh. Holly, I'll ask you to offer opening comments next.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation for today, and it's a great honor to be here. I would like to maybe just take a big picture view, of bird's eye, not even a bird's eye view, a kind of a beyond a hawk's, maybe a God's eye view of what's going on here. And why is it that the U.S. is being watched around the world as, you know, this election plays itself out and what happens? And I think it's that, you know, we can't discuss politics today without understanding the media ecosystem in which it operates. And that media ecosystem is also changed since the arrival of the internet. And so it used to be when the internet came along, we all were told that the engine driving the internet was what that one Supreme Court justice said, I don't know if I can define it, but I know it when I see it, right? That's what used to define the internet. But what I think defines the internet now, from what I've seen, is political polarization. And the difficulty about that in democracies is that it leads to what we in political science call affective polarization, which means that you don't like me because I'm a Democrat, and I don't like you because I'm a Republican, or because you're a Republican, let's say, for example, even though we've never met, and even though you know, we don't know each other, right? And we may have so much in common, we just happen to have one quirky reason why we're going for one candidate or another. And so we're seeing more polarization in different countries. In European countries, today's one of our topics, so particularly in the European context. We're also seeing a growth of small political parties, relatively new in the last 15 years, starting up, or 10 years even. And that's fostered as well through new media that we have available to us and social media platforms. And so getting back to the point that Josh made about media and freedom of the press, we hadn't envisioned when we thought about that initially that everybody is his or her own marketer and journalist at the same time, and that the gatekeeper, which used to be, you know, television news, which was impartial back in the day, was going to become seen as part of this world of polarization. And so I think that's where I'd like to leave my remarks for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Holly. And David.
Sure, thanks, Lauren, and it's good to be with all of you at a momentous time in our nation's history. You guys picked this topic and this time wisely, and we'll hope if we can give us all a little more confidence, but also maybe alleviate some of the free-floating anxiety that's out there. My perspective is very much grounded in this city and in this Commonwealth, which has some pluses and minuses. As Lauren knows, and a lot of you on the call know, Philadelphia is a real place that values authenticity. We've been practicing, some say, rough and humble politics for a good while, but I think it's a great portal into some of the issues, not all the issues facing this country and our democracy. And let me just sort of tick off a few, maybe starting with the good things and then pivoting to some of the challenges. I mean, Joshua mentioned this at the outset, but voting in this election is going to be off the charts. My friend Nate Personally from Stanford called it the 100-year flood of voting, and I think that's a pretty good way of thinking about it. The second thing is, and we both Holly and Josh talked a little bit about the media. I'd like to stand up for local journalism. I think, at least in the Philadelphia area, the response of our scrappy local journalists, all trying to make a living, which is not easy, to this election has really been extraordinary. Very well covered. We do have the challenge that Holly mentioned, which is that everybody is not only their own consumer, but also producer of news, and sort of trying to establish the anchors of trust is really a challenge. Let me just talk for a second about some of the challenges. I read I would commend to all of you, there's a great article, I think, in today's New York Times about the challenge that we have of regaining or reforming trust in institutions and in democracy. I think that's really fundamental. We've just seen, and you could see this in surveys and lots of things, a kind of an erosion of trust, not just in government democracy, but in lots of institutions in this country. And we need that trust. We need trust in norms and not just closely defined rules or laws that often end up in litigation. Interestingly, our organization just floated a full-page ad in the Inquirer yesterday. Good old, kind of an old-fashioned response to the Times that says we have to trust this process, and we should trust this process. So that's our vote for at least trying to keep us anchored and maybe push us back towards a more trusting view of this democracy. The last thing I'd say is, and many of these things have been said many times, but our politics seem to have devolved into a sense of, we all have a very clear sense of what we're against or who we're against. We have much less of a sense of what we're for, which I think is troubling. And if we can figure out a way, and maybe in the ashes of this election, we'll find some way forward. But that, to me, is a real challenge we have to tackle head on.
Yeah.
Thank you, David. I like that. What are we for? That's a nice way to think about how to move forward after the ashes of this election, as you said. And so, of course, we are here tonight on the eve of the election to talk about democracy. And so we must start off with the election on our first question here. And while we know tomorrow is election day, and perhaps some even think it will be election week or months or even quarter, we all are wondering what will happen next. And some of us remember the 2000 election between Gore and Bush, and even fewer were here around for the 1960s tight race between Nixon and Kennedy. This will be the first time that many Americans experience an uncertain or delayed result. We know that delays and uncertainty of any type always cast doubt on any situation. The question is, how do we mitigate that doubt and instill and ensure confidence for the long haul? We touched a little bit about this and some of the optimism you all express and what you'd like to see going forward, but I'd like to ask you, Josh, what is your recommendation to bolster confidence among American citizens for future elections? What should be done, and conversely, what should not be done?
So I think starting this cycle, even right now, expectation setting is critical, because part of why all of us think something has gone awry or is being mishandled is when it doesn't align with our expectations. So it's not too late to help Americans understand, for example, that ballot counting almost certainly will continue past election night, and that may mean that it's not clear who the winner is. There may be projections that are pretty reliable, but there may not be. That there's nothing illegitimate about that. In fact, it would be illegitimate to stop counting ballots that should be counted, legitimate ballots, prematurely, or expectation setting with respect to the role that mail-in ballots play. We know there are going to be a lot of them this cycle. There's a pandemic that unfortunately continues to rage in this country and some other countries that has led people, including me, to vote via mail-in ballots. So to set expectations that There's nothing illegitimate about not knowing election night results, or that mail-in ballots have statistically negligible fraud to them. That expectation setting can help people understand that the result isn't to be doubted or treated skeptically, let alone resisted with some sort of force or violence if they're unhappy with it. And then, Lauren, just to broaden the answer to your broader question, which is not really just about this cycle, but about the future, we should learn from this process. Some states dove in and they tried to do things to facilitate voting in a safer and potentially more reliable way, given that we're going to be voting differently, more early voting, more mail-in voting, more voting, because there's so much passion about this. Now, there's been big fights in courts about whether the right actors in the right states did the right thing to make these changes, and that's continuing even. But going forward, let's not just breathe a sigh of relief when we get through this. Let's figure out how we should be voting in this country, what polling stations should be like, whether ballot processing, which is even different from ballot counting, should be done ahead of election day so we do have a sense of results sooner. What it means to have our machines and roles and databases better protected from potential cyber intrusions. All that stuff we talk about so often when it's too late to fix, or when fixing it feels like it leans towards one party or the other, so it's fraught. If we could fix it in the quiet times in between, I think that would be a lot better.
Good advice. All right, Holly, I've got a question for you. While the press we know is not an actual fourth branch of the government, many say the other three would not function without it. Let's talk about the role of a free press in democracy and how in policy decisions and elections, the press are perceived and those factors are perceived by the public at large. I'm thinking specifically about things with our friends in Europe, like Brexit, or back to the election between Macron and Le Pen in France in 2017. We must also strongly consider the role of social media, as we outlined in the opening comments, the role of social media in democracy and how different platforms influence policy, elections, and perceptions, and even the understanding of what constitutes a fact. Holly, you've written a lot about this, particularly in the context of Europe. Mind if we start with you? How are policy and elections affected by the press? And what do you see as the biggest impact of social media and how to mitigate the challenges?
Well, I think we can't, thank you very much for the question. I think we can't, sorry about that noise, but the trash collectors are going up the street right now. Anyway, waited, it was a long day apparently. And I'm in the living room, so we're right on we're right in the noise capture zone. I think that we cannot think about politics today anywhere as being anything like it was even just 10 years ago because of social media. And it's not that the technology is guilty. Okay, we do have some evidence that technology has been guilty in not keeping up with the problems online that they're confronting. But I mean, in theory, at the beginning, just like every form of technology, including missile technology, it's supposedly neutral. It's just when it's in the hands of bad actors. But in a way, we've all become sometimes angry bad actors. And so we tweet something here or there, right? And so sometimes having this opportunity to just air what we think immediately, well, it's resulted in historical shifts, of public opinion if something goes viral. And yet it also is a hotbed for misinformation and worse, disinformation when there's a message put out or an actor putting out a message is intending to deceive. And we have many such actors online right now, especially in the U.S. election. And we know this, we've seen reports on this. And because our media system is somewhat polarized, our traditional media system, at least television news in that extent, we may have seen that information on some channels, but not others. But I wanted to just pull together for a moment the thread between the United States and Brexit. So the Brexit problem, I assume everybody knows the Brexit problem. Britain is about to withdraw from Brexit without a final deal, unless I missed it in those 3 days that my power was out. So let's go back to that campaign. The Brexit campaign in 2016 had the polls clearly on Remain, and then at the last week or it became narrower. Well, by the time it got to the last week, it was quite narrow. People were not understanding why, in part because they were only talking online to their own groups of people, right? And so another piece of research that has come out is that what happened in Brexit was that a lot of low information voters were motivated to vote, and they were motivated to vote leave. And this was in part because of the kinds of messaging they would have been receiving, not only through the actual on-the-ground campaign, but through the social media as well. And so, you know, it changed the result. You know, very small change, but a massive change. It caused a lot of disruption in the European context. And there was a big news about one fake ad on a bus, a red bus that was being sent around by the Brexit campaign, arguing that Britain would sends 350 million pounds per week, and we would be getting all of that back, and we could invest it into schools and the health service. And that turned out afterwards to be a lie, according to Nigel Farage, who was one of the co-leaders of the Brexit campaign to leave. And he blamed it on Boris because the two of them had ingeniously co-chaired the campaign. And he said that was somebody else's decision. I didn't take the decision on that ad. Nevertheless, we did see Nigel Farage just the other day on a rally with President Trump. So let's not underestimate what we see in terms of, you know, parties on one side of the political fence, you know, doing together. There's the latest Trump ad that I saw online on Twitter was just a train, Make America Great Again, and then the next two carriages have a little picture of or words on them. One of those words is Brexit. So we are interfering with one another's elections, even if we're alliances, right? We're taking sides with one another's elections. And when we're not in alliance, this is where we have a bigger problem. And we know this problem of disinformation has meant that many people, including myself, and I hope all of you were not like me in 2016, receiving and retweeting by accident, not knowing that a Russian source was sending this information out. So there's a whole pattern to disinformation. The course I teach on media and politics moved to become disinformation this year because so much scholarship and research has now been published on it. It wasn't available in 2016. But what we see is an early effort to befriend you and then bring you in. And with this problem called QAnon, which Facebook eventually banned a few weeks back, we see, and it still exists in various forms with many different names, we see conspiracy theories rife online and on other venues where lots of people are getting their news on their handheld devices, going to YouTube, getting news, etc. And so we have this problem of disinformation feeding many news diets that people are on. And this is what I think is causing the fear. And this is why we're seeing a lot of anxiety right now.
A lot to wrestle with without answers that are particularly clear or reforms that we can see the path to, because this is new technology and we're certainly in a new era. As you said, Holly, there's no playbook, right? We're learning from 16 to 20. Where will we be 4 years from now? And there's a lot of questions and topics around the idea of reform. You know, we're not even through this election. Technically, it's not even election day, although nearly 100 million Americans have voted, but we're already talking about how to reform, which I think is perhaps a healthy sign of democracy, but a challenging one. David, I'd like to talk to you about reform. We know that voters and citizens are confused enough about this current situation, and there's certainly no lack of topics when we think about what do the citizens want to be changed, what does the machine want to be changed, what do experts like yourself think need to be changed, from gerrymandering to the pros and cons of term limits, from campaign finance reform to closed primaries, from instituting ranked choice voting to calls to abolish the Electoral College. Which of these do you think are threats to U.S. democracy? Which of them could help? I'd love to hear your perspective on that, David.
Sure. I'm glad to, Lauren. Those are familiar topics and all important. Let me pick three of them that have been on our plate for the last couple of years. because I think all three of these are structural fixes that if we could pull them off would result in kind of a re-knitting together of what I think of as a political process that isn't much in evidence these days, which is the old-fashioned, you say X, I say Y, we come together and meet in the middle on A, B, or C, I guess. The first of those is redistricting reform, or another way to say it is to end partisan gerrymandering, which I've come convinced since I've been at the Committee of 70 is one of the, as a colleague of mine says, the great bugs in the operating system of democracy. And we don't understand how badly it affects our decision-making process, and to Josh's point early, how it helps turn everything into a partisan kind of game of tug. And I'm hopeful around that, by the way. Let me just say something about our response to that issue. For the last 4 years ago, we launched a project in Pennsylvania called Draw the Lines PA. It's based on a simple principle, which is let's give every citizen in the Commonwealth the ability to draw his or her own maps, own election maps. And we raised some foundation money to do that. And 4 years later, we've had 6,000 people, many of them young folks, take us up on that. We've done twice yearly competitions. With somewhat tongue in cheek, we say this is the largest example of hands-on citizen engagement on this issue in the history of the country. But it really has been extraordinary, and it points out that this issue means something to people of all ages. And the point of this, by the way, is to make sure that those voices are heard when we come to drawing the official election maps in 2021, which we need to do for the U.S. Congress, all of our state legislative seats, and I remind folks in Philadelphia, our city council seats. So again, the basic premise, which sounds kind of pretty common sense, is that the districts should be defined and drawn with the interests and the voices of the people that are defined by those districts, and not by the people who represent them temporarily. So that's point one. Second one is opening our primary election system to independent voters. We don't realize this in Pennsylvania, but most states allow people who are registered independents or nonpartisans or unaffiliated, they're known by various labels, to vote in primary elections. And we don't. And the latest registration numbers came out. Fully 14% of voters in Pennsylvania now are registered as something other than a Republican or Democrat, which, people think like, well, that's their problem. Why don't they register as a Republican or Democrat, and then they could vote in primary elections? But I think there's something even offensive about that. First of all, we all pay for primary elections. We all pay for elections. So why shouldn't we be able to participate? And then the other thing is that when we elect people in partisan primaries, which tend to be low turnout elections, we only reinforce the kind of tyranny of the minority that we seem to be afflicted by in lots of areas of our politics now. So when those folks get elected to the legislature or to Congress, they have very little narrow political interest in representing everybody. And instead, their efforts are concentrated on representing their sometimes very narrow base. So opening primaries, I think, would make a big difference. By the way, for folks around the country, this has been a growing movement around the country. There is a major ballot initiative in the state of Florida right now to open primary elections. Some years ago, it's been probably 6 or 8 years ago, California went to a top two primary system, which means that you file to run in a primary election with whatever party you want, but as a voter, you get to pick the top two, and those folks go on to the general election, whether they're Democrats, Republicans, or something else. And it's had a very, I think, positive effect on California politics, which most folks had given up for lost. People thought California is ungovernable, and I think this demonstrates that these kinds of structural fixes can really work. The third thing I wanted to turn to, as you mentioned it, is ranked choice voting, which is a really interesting way of voting. Once you dive into this, you realize there's all kinds of ways of voting, and we just happen to fasten on one of them most often. But ranked choice voting is based on the principle that to get selected for an office, you should have at least 50% of the votes cast, which is not the system we have in Philadelphia or in Pennsylvania or in most elections. We allow for simply a plurality. So if you're the top vote getter with 31% of the votes, then you either go on to the general election or you win the general election or what have you. And ranked choice voting prohibits that. And it is a little more complicated because you're asked to rank candidates in your order of preference rather than just choosing one or the other. And there's a pretty elegant way of kind of rolling up votes so that if the first place candidate doesn't get more than 50% of the votes the first go round, you eliminate the lowest ranked candidate and reallocate votes until that person gets more than 50% of the votes. Some folks refer to this as instant runoff voting, which is another way to think about it. So again, this sounds maybe like kind of a laboratory experiments by political scientists, except I think there's an enormous amount of appetite for this kind of system because it encourages, again, candidates and office holders to seek the votes of a wider variety of voters, and then when they get in office, to be more responsive to those voters. And it's gained traction. The state of Maine will use ranked choice voting after enormous legal back and forth in this presidential election. New York City will use ranked choice voting for its municipal elections this coming year. And it's on the ballot in Massachusetts as well. So I think this is a movement whose time has come. And the other thing that I always like to say to folks in Philadelphia, it's a very Quakerly form of voting because it's kind of a consensus. It's a vehicle to drive consensus and to respect consensus. In fact, the national organization that promotes ranked choice voting is run by two dyed-in-the-wool Quakers. We should have our imprint on national politics. I think it's about time. So those are my three structural fixes. The final thing I would say is there's more than a little room, and I expect everybody on this panel would agree, for the return of teaching good old-fashioned civics. I think, to Josh's point earlier, if we had a better sense of our past and a better sense of where our political institutions come from and how they've been tested in the past, that would help us to calibrate expectations that we could then bring to the present and the future. And I say that as my first job out of college was as a social studies teacher. So I figured, and I was teaching American history to 7th and 8th graders when they weren't, squirming wildly in their seats. But I really do believe we've got to get back to that because, we need to be steeped in all of the twists and turns of this American experiment if we're going to try to figure out how to make it work better going into the future.
Thank you, David. I'd like to ask Joshua or Holly if you have any additional perspective on the idea of reforms to our democracy, things you see in other countries, particularly Western Europe. That's the lens we're approaching this conversation with tonight, of either practices that have been in place for a long time that America might look at to help us strengthen our democracy, or paths you think particularly we shouldn't go down. And if you'd like, if there's a lens of how the pandemic has been used to restrict or created opportunities for enhancing democratic participation, I would be curious to hear what your thoughts are on that. Josh, we'll start with you.
Sure, a couple of thoughts on that. So, and really the first one picks up on David's good comments about a need for rejuvenated and augmented education in civics. And I think in addition to that, or maybe I should say as part of that, digital literacy seems to be critical. It's not the same as understanding our institutions in the sense of Congress and the Supreme Court and the presidency, but they are institutions, as we've all been saying, that we must live with, that we are living with, social media platforms and file upload sites and other aspects of today's internet, let alone tomorrow's internet. And there are countries that have worked to help their populations navigate those with more information and with more skepticism and with an overall healthier approach. Estonia, in part because it was on the front lines of facing some of the first wave of Russian-backed, cyber-enabled challenges to political dialogue and really political integrity, has dedicated itself to becoming a global leader in trying to have a population that has cyber resilience. France is offering education at relatively young ages in what it means to be a decent digital citizen, to treat what one encounters online with a healthy skepticism, the way we should treat it. And so I think that is a part of our way forward here in the United States, where we could learn quite a bit from European partners and from other countries. Japan has tried to get better at building digital health, digital literacy. Then there's another really perhaps more negative and more gloomy point, but it's something where I think we need to devote even more attention here in the United States. And we have seen this problem in Europe and elsewhere, which is the problem, the threat posed by private, unaccountable, unsanctioned, ultimately unlawful militias. And I think in the national consciousness, that weekend of Unite the Right in August 2017 in Charlottesville, Virginia, still looms large in our minds. In some ways, I hope it does, because what we've seen over the past 3+ years is an escalation, a boldness on the part of these groups. They are not militias in the constitutional sense of the word. They take it on themselves to decide when to deploy and use force, even though every state in the country has some law, and most have multiple layers of law that prohibit that. And we've seen what this leads to in other countries when individual citizens take force into their own hands and challenge the state's monopoly on the legitimate use of force. It does not lead down the road to a healthy democracy or even a peaceful and safe one. And to use the laws we already have on the books here in the United States to make sure we put those back on the sidelines, take that off the field of play as part of our democratic landscape, I think that's really urgent.
Yes,
Holly?
here in Georgia, I live near Emory University where I work, and I'm working from home, as we all are now, because I have the CDC nestled into our campus, and we listen to the CDC, and we also provide commentary to the CDC. I mean, not myself, but all our medical people do. And so I just noticed that last night we had a big rally. Apparently it was 30,000 people in Rome, Georgia. And that was a Trump rally. That was the end of the day, I believe, for President Trump. And that was another, what Stanford economists might call a super spreader event that we'll learn more about later. But the issue, I think, is militia were threatening, this is what I read online, or I read from a news source, let's say, through Twitter. Yeah, that militia were, because the police were overbooked with providing security for the president when the Democrats tried to hold a rally on the same day in a different location, there was no ability to support that. Yet, so just, threats from militia led to Democrats to cancel a rally at the same time because they couldn't have police support, right? And then we see what's happened recently in Texas. It seems it was dismissed by President Trump as, oh, they were just being nice, people in big trucks with Trump flags, Trump-Pence flags, surrounding the Biden-Harris bus and maybe trying to run it off the road. What were they really trying to do? We don't know. But the point is, tactics on the ground are not what they used to be, I mean, we used to have ground wars, but this is a new level of ground war, let's say, in campaigning. And this is, I think, one of our biggest problems, really, because we don't have the ability for especially for young people coming into the system now, or even just voting for the second time around, to realize that it hasn't always been this way. Many of us can still remember Walter Cronkite saying, and that's the way it is, at the TV news ended, and we believed him. we just said, yeah, that's the way it is. So, you know, we have a whole our generation gap is less digital than you know, having the plurality of digital technology that we had. Television when there were facts, right? Television ended the facts, I think, in the early 2000s officially, so to speak. We went to a news analysis format. But I did want to come to this point about ranked voting. Ranked choice voting. It reminded me of, you know, if I was German, I'd be voting in a different election, or the same election, but for two different types of electoral systems. I'd have a simple plurality system where I vote for the candidate, and then I vote for multi-member districts. And so we have to remember that on the continent of Europe, we have a parliamentary system, right? Parties know they have to go into a coalition most of the time. And so when I lived in the Netherlands for 8 years, I said, gee, everybody's so nice during campaigns here. What's going on? And my political science colleagues said, well, they all know they have to enter into coalitions, so they're not going to really attack each other too much, right? Well, that's changed. We've gotten many more attacks across the European parliamentary context, but nevertheless, they do have to form coalitions. And what you were referring to was the fact that candidates themselves could start to reach out to voters. But I think the challenge there is going to be the other end. When the system is structurally designed to oppose, in theory, a two-party system, we have this polarization issue augmented, right? And so we're seeing the only two countries in Europe, the UK and in the United States, having this so-called Westminster style system, which is based on a simple plurality of the vote, two parties running, right? But once you get several parties running, which we always have had, it makes a mockery of making decisions about who's going to win. I still don't understand how the Indian pollsters are doing it, because they have a Westminster system too, but they have hundreds of political parties, right? And we do see votes going every which way in every state level election and nationally. So I think that we are confronted with very big change here. This is an election outcome that we're all worried about. I'm optimistic about whatever happens, that we'll, move on to the next challenge. But back to that God's eye view that I thought we should be taking from above right now, if we look and see what the big challenges we should be concerned with now, I think it would be having a global vaccine. It would be global cooperation. What do we need now? We need more global cooperation. We need human beings to recognize we have a human race, and we need to work together across all different areas to deal with the crisis of the planet, to deal with the crisis of this pandemic and the next one, to deal with the way we're going to agree on CRISPR activity, right? What are we going to do about the technology that has excelled exponentially, taking us to a point of, do we want to continue to be human beings, or do we want to add certain superhuman qualities to our genome, right? And so do we have global consensus on that or not? Instead, what do we have? We have not only polarization in the US or polarization in the UK particularly, but we have President Trump taking our strongest allies and taking our long-standing arrangements such as NATO and calling them into question, or calling into question the Paris Accords on climate change, for example. Now, what this has done is it's given his supporters, a thrill, a huge thrill. They're extremely happy. Pulling out of the WHO in the middle of a pandemic, huge thrill, But for others, and I say others being outside of the United States, because that's one of my research projects, is how is the media reporting on the United States around the world, and what are we seeing? And, it really has diminished the stature of the presidency and the country. And problematically, I think terribly problematically, is the fact that among our allies, can we be trusted? And we being a function of our leader in office. And I think he really has one objective, and it's the same objective, apart from being reelected, it's the same objective that we see and in terms of the long strategy that has been said to have been created in one country bordering Europe, and that's the country that has is home to Gazprom, that can turn down the heat when it gets too problematic. When the former Eastern Bloc countries start acting up, you can just turn the heat down. But I'm just mentioning this because there is really this much discord, this much difficulty really shouldn't be happening. We shouldn't have to see this level of hostility. So it's a trend on polarization coming from political parties, possibly coming from social media especially, but also coming from outside actors, creating a picture of socialism versus whatever else there is. I just want to remind everyone that when we do studies of parties internationally and we compare Europe with the United States, we can see that every right-wing political party, or center-right even, or far-right even, let's take far-right, the labeled parties far-right, Marine Le Pen's party, which has received, Front National, which has received a nice makeover from Steve Bannon, even before he had to close down his alt-right school in the Italian countryside, because the judges there didn't want a monastery to be used for that purpose. But we see there is a link with respect to, again, this problem of polarization. We're also seeing it in different ways with Alternative for Deutschland, a group of economists, which I wouldn't call them far right, started the party because they were frustrated with certain European Union regulations that they found bureaucratic. So more free enterprise, right? It evolved, though, after they lost their first election, into something more anti-immigrant. And so what we see primarily across Europe is anti-immigrant hostility and rhetoric across parties that are considered alt-right or far-right. And so at a time when we need to be coming together to solve global problems, we're more divisive than ever. We're divisive between alliance nations. We're divisive within our own nations. We're divisive within our own communities. We're divisive across the issue of what our identity is, right? White lives, Black lives, all this social media hashtagging of slogans, right? And I personally believe Black Lives Matter. That's my view, okay? And I think that's very important to say that slogan, because that slogan originated with the movement to stop, the unfortunate killings of so many Black men originally, but it's led to another slogan called White Lives Matter, or All Lives Matter, right? And so we see this kind of polarization coming up again and again and again, and to the point where we're all thinking, in code almost about what is being said and therefore what is not being said, right? And so we need to remember that about 30 years ago, it was very clear that one country that has that fancy bear out on the streets. I sat on the lap of a fancy bear once in Moscow in 1991, but that one country has a goal of sowing discord, sowing polarization, and causing the kind of disruption that we're seeing today. And the leadership of that country is what I'm referring to, because the people, I think, are really great people. Thank you.
Right, and we've got a tremendous amount of questions coming in from our audience, so I want to make sure we've got a few time for those. And as always, we like to kick it off with a student question. A local junior from Bodine High School for International Affairs here in Philadelphia, Nina Diaz, is with us. We know the future leaders are with us here today, making waves politically that we haven't seen in a few generations. Nina, I'll pass it over to you. I'd love for you to open up our audience Q&A right now.
Thank you. My question is for Mr. Thornburg. However, if any of the other panelists would like to add on, that would be greatly appreciated. As a young person who is looking forward to voting and participating in democratic processes in the future, what do you see as the biggest threat to the American democracy in regards to the current presidential election? Do you believe this threat will have a long-term effect or a short-term effect on the future of America's democracy?
Well, you asked me the easy ones, huh? Well, look, as I said at the outset, the one thing that I am just we have to be encouraged and thrilled by is this is just the sheer number of people, particularly young people, it appears, heading to the polls leading up to the election tomorrow. That's the good news. But I am concerned that we have structural problems in this country and at the state level that we have to fix. And I talked about some of them: gerrymandering, Lauren threw the electoral college on the table. And much as it's fun to be in Pennsylvania and to be wanted by all the political parties and the pundits and so forth, you feel bad for the folks in California or New York or places, or Illinois, where there are millions of people voting, but they don't matter. So I guess my encouragement is, and I think this is a responsibility we all have as citizens, beyond just voting in a particular system, in a particular structure, is we have to reserve some capacity to think about the way we are governed. And, again, invoking that wonderful sense of the American experiment, how we can keep improving the way we are governed and the way we make choices. So that's which again, I think that's the great thing about our educators, is they force us to ask those questions because they're not bounded by just the realities of where we are right now. So that would be my encouragement to you, Nina, and your fellow students, and to all of us, is you have to keep asking ourselves, is this working out well? Is this working out the way it was intended? And what can we do to fix it?
Thank you, David. Josh, we've got a question for you here. On the topic of modifying election expectations and processes, how do we overcome the issue that states conduct and control the election process with no obligation to follow what another state next to them or across the country may choose to do? Additionally, if the party in control of the state legislatures can exert influence at their whim, is change really possible at the national level, particularly when Congress is always controlled by a single party?
Well, it's a good question, and let me maybe break it into a few parts. So in terms of setting expectations appropriately right now, I don't actually mean anything about changing rules so much as having people understand what those rules are, because the disinformation that actors in our political system already are spreading about this cycle, about mail-in ballots, or when we purportedly need to know a result by, that's out of sync with what the rules already are, and the process that goes from November 3rd to December 8th, the federal safe harbor deadline for states to resolve election disputes, to December 14, when the Electoral College meets, to January 6, when the joint session of Congress hashes out what may still be disputes over slates of electors, and ultimately January 20, when the current presidential term ends. So I just mean helping people understand that this, what the process currently is, so they don't view any result consistent with it as being illegitimate. But more broadly, it is true that a lot of what is done to implement our system of elections, including for federal elections, is done at the state level. That means that state legislatures sure have some work to do. And in fact, one story of the pandemic and voting during it has been states trying to adapt in the way I mentioned before, and in some ways adapting more swiftly than they often do. So maybe there's hope there. But the adaptations should be systemic, and the adaptations should learn from this cycle so that states absorb the right lessons and the right takeaways. So it is about what happens at the state level to a certain extent. At the same time, Congress and the president have worked before to figure out what our constitutional structure enables at the federal level. And it does enable some things. It's enabled, for example, a push for greater funding to be provided to state and locals to have more current, better functioning, more reliable voting machines. It's even encouraged and incentivized an ability to register to vote more easily. So there are things that can be done at the federal level. And then finally, one other piece brings this all together, which is the question of when federal courts, and we've seen this at the Supreme Court, we've seen it at lower federal courts, should be second guessing how states are resolving election disputes cropping up right now, right on the brink of election day, under their own state laws and state constitutions. And one thing that has troubled a number of us, at least who work on constitutional legal issues, is this notion really emerging in recent weeks that because the U.S. Constitution assigns to the legislature the setting of the manner of elections in states for House and Senate and the presidency, that somehow if other actors within states, executive branch officials, state courts, play any role whatsoever in implementing laws passed out of the legislature or interpreting laws, that somehow this is a federal constitutional problem. And that is directly at odds with the Supreme Court decision from 2015. It's just at odds with common sense. Laws are passed out of the legislature, often with a gubernatorial signature, but then officials need to implement them and deal with tensions, and courts need to interpret them. So in some ways, what we need to do is make sure that the state's will actually does prevail, when in fact it would be federal courts misconstruing our federal constitution as a way to override state resolution of these issues.
Hey, Lauren, let me just jump in, because I think Josh made a great point. Go back to our friend gerrymander. If we didn't have legislators comprised of people that represent highly gerrymandered districts, they would have more ability and more incentive to compromise around election reform or election rules or whatever, and which would, if they could make those decisions themselves, they wouldn't end up in the court. I look at this blossoming of litigation and court decisions around these things as a failure. We've failed. We can't come together in a legislature because I would suggest we've got very few people who are there representing, a broader cross section of the electorate, who are then incentivized to compromise. So I think there's you got to sort of trace the problem back to the source as well.
Holly, we've got just a minute left. I wanted to see if you had any closing thoughts before we have to wrap up our conversation and go stare at the news for the next 24 hours.
Well, just to close the point, if I didn't make it already about healthcare and political parties, I would love to make that quick point, which I do in my classes, which may be getting me in a bad evaluation sometimes. But if you actually look at Marine Le Pen's party or all the so-called populist far-right parties in Europe, none of them are advocating getting rid of healthcare or health insurance for the French people or the German people or the Italians or the British. They just don't want those immigrants coming in or those refugees coming in to have what they have. That's not the same pie, right? So there's selfishness there, right? But they're not trying to take it away from their own citizens. We have the only political party in the world, if you compare it with even South Korea, which has a superb functioning healthcare system that has kicked the pandemic almost as quickly as Taiwan. We have one political party that is wanting to take healthcare away, and they're going to be doing that on the 10th of November. And as far as we know, there's no plan to replace the pre-existing conditions, keeping your kids on the insurance policy till they're 26, and lifetime cap on medical bills. We are the only country that has bankruptcies happening to people who have health insurance because they can't afford their medical bills. And so we have a unique, unfortunate facet of the so-called American exceptionalism, is one in trying to explain to people how health insurance actually works in this country, because most Americans don't understand how it works. And even medical billing is a question mark for many, understanding it. So I think we have to distinguish our parties here from parties in Europe, because they all have that bottom line basic national health service that in Britain, Winston Churchill pushed that, and he was a Tory, he was a conservative, right? So I just wanted you to think about that.
Thank you, Holly. We certainly have a myriad of problems or challenges that our country and our democracy is facing, and our friends around the world. But I'm glad that we got to some solutions and ideas and best practice sharing. Certainly more questions than answers here on the eve of the election. And I'm so grateful that Josh, Holly, and David, that you could join us here tonight, and that our audience chose to spend an hour with us in deep discussion, and no yelling, no fighting, no drama, but just a good exchange of ideas. I'd like to also thank our education series partner, the Hobbs School of Business at St. Joseph's University, and our series corporate sponsor, KeyBank, for their long-time commitment to the Council's mission of bringing global education and civil discourse to Philadelphians and people around the world. I'm glad for our audience tonight, and thank you for engaging on these critical issues. And I invite you to join us again in the coming weeks for the next 2 installments of this series you saw tonight, Democracy on the Table. And we have a very special interview coming up on November 19th with Saudi Arabia's first female ambassador ever. She was sent to the United States in 2019, and she'll be here with us for an intimate interview on November 19th. Until then, stay safe, stay sane and healthy, and vote. Thank you very much. Good night.